Good evening, everybody. Good to see you. And continuing this series, it's a strange juxtaposition, but there's I'm sure, some deep meaning in it. But we're looking at parables and then at church councils. So something from Scripture, something from tradition. And I thought we would begin tonight with a very well-known parable, the most well-known parable, the parable of the two sons, or the parable of the prodigal son. Now, we might just sort of go through this together, and I'm sure people will throw great light on it. Yeah, this is a famous and wonderful parable, and I must admit, even for me, just spending some time with the parables for these talks has been eye-opening. They are quite extraordinary. I think, they could only have come from someone who was divine as well as human. There is something quite astonishing about them, and you can spend your whole life going into them. Now, this one is the longest in the Gospels. There is no parable longer, and it has been called the Gospel in the Gospel, Evangelium in Evangelio. If you really want to capture the essence of the Gospel, then this is it. I would recommend a very good book on it, which I'm afraid I can't remember the title, but it's by Henry Nouwen. Is it The Return of the Return Home? I think he did two, at least, on it, and it's focused on Rembrandt's painting as well, which we will see later. Now, here's just a quotation. This is about parables in general. A biblical story is not simply a delivery system for an idea. That's been one thesis. Rather, the story first creates a world and then invites the listener to live in that world, to take it on as part of who he or she is. Biblical stories invite the reader to accept them as his or her story. And another image is a parable is a house with many rooms which we're invited to enter. I remember when we looked at the parable of the Good Samaritan, we found ourselves getting interested in the innkeeper, a relatively minor character apparently, but suddenly several people connected with the innkeeper. And so there's always more here. Now, before we get into it one by one, we've got all these questions, we've got all these pictures. The whole chapter. This is Luke chapter 15. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. You know how in the Gospel of Luke, for many chapters, it's repeated again and again that Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. And there, he's going to die among sinners, and apparently as a sinner, and for sinners. And this begins off with the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him, to hear him, and the Pharisees and the scribes murmured, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." But later, Jesus is going to die with them. And this is, yes, and so there are three parables in this chapter, as you remember. Perhaps he answers them, he answers this criticism at the beginning with three parables. The first one about the lost sheep. So how the shepherd leaves the 99 and goes after the lost sheep. Then the parable of the woman who loses the coin and sweeps her house and finds the coin. So there's a lost sheep and then a lost coin, a man and a woman first, and then they're sort of warm-ups for the big parable, which is this one, with a father who has, well, does he have one lost son or does he have two lost sons? He really has two lost sons, as you find. So they're lost in different ways, but they are both lost. So it's all about finding, first an animal, lose a sheep, then money, a coin, and then finally people, children. And now there was a man who had two sons. Now, it's not often I get an original light on these things, but it just struck me this afternoon. You've got, the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes murmured, saying, so you've got Jesus here, and you've got tax collectors and sinners, and you've got Pharisees and scribes. Then you've got a man two sons, son one and son two. This is the interesting question of who is the father in the parable? Is it God the Father, or is it Jesus, or both? Okay, now we've got a family. We've got a father, a man who has two sons. Now, it is said that, and this is still true in many parts of the world, but certainly would have been true in the Middle East in Jesus' time, that anyone's primary identity was as a member of their family. They didn't really have a sense of me as a distinct, separated, isolated individual person. Their identity was being a member of a family. And this is what makes this a very dramatic story. Now, the other thing, because this is about a family being torn apart, this is what happens. And the other thing is, when you hear this parable, where do you spontaneously imagine it taking place? Obviously there's a father, he's got servants, he's got hired servants, he's got a son. There's no mention of, a mother, but, presumably. Here are these, now where do you, so you imagine a house and land. But where do you imagine it? Where would you set the parable? Where do you think they were living?
The countryside.
Yeah, that's what we all automatically think. We think of a nice house on a hill with, an orchard and everything, and a nice road leading down to it. But that wouldn't have been the case. People didn't live like that in isolated houses on hilltops. They lived in villages. So this would all have happened in a village, and the villagers are sort of just off stage in the whole story. But actually, they're quite important in the whole thing. This man, though he's certainly a wealthy man, because he can, you remember at the end, he can hire musicians for a party. He's got fatted calves, he's got, sheep and goats, and he's got hired servants. But where he would actually have lived is in the village. And the streets in the villages would have been extraordinarily narrow, as you still would see in some old European cities. And so if you'd had a balcony, your house had a balcony, you would have been able to reach over to someone on the balcony on the other side. So this all isn't happening in glorious isolation in a mansion or in Rubislaw Den North or somewhere. It's happening right in the middle of a village where everybody knows what's happening to everybody else. Okay. I think it brings some of this alive. And yes, and economically, the basic unit was a household. A landowner and his family and his extended family, and the daughters-in-law and the children and the grandchildren and the hired servants and so forth. All of that. Now, he says, what does he say? The younger of them, that's often, we have biblical stories about two sons, one who's younger, one who's older, going all the way back to Cain and Abel. And he says to his father, Father, give me the share of property that falls to me. Now, that's an astonishing thing to say to your father, because when would you expect to inherit your father's property? When he dies. So what he's saying is, Dad, I want you dead. I want you dead. Now, what a normal father would have done would have just slapped him across the face. But this father does a whole series of extraordinary things all through this parable. He doesn't behave like an Oriental patriarch of a family at all. And so, Father, give me the share of property that falls. And he divided his living between them. Now, yes, somewhere in the Old Testament, in the book of Sirach, to son or wife, to brother or friend, do not give power over yourself as long as you live, and do not give your property to another. So this father was flouting the wisdom of Israel, and the whole village would have known, and would have said, well, he's lost his marbles. What a silly idiot. Now, the elder brother, it's an interesting thing, the elder brother would have benefited from this too. Because it says he divided his living, and actually it's the word bios, which can mean just his life, between them. So actually, the elder brother did rather well out of this, because he got his bit. And so there it is. So, you're the father. I mean, who are we in this parable? We're actually all three people at least. And maybe we'll find someone else we can be. But you have just been told by your son, I'd like you dead, actually. I want my stuff now. And this most unusual father gives it to him. Now, in the Greek, the order is actually different. In verse 13, the younger son gathered all he had. Now, the learned people who know about the Greek language say that the word gathered, that it can mean gathered, he got everything together, but it also can mean he liquidated, he turned into cash His father had given him, half the fields, half the servants or whatever, and he turned them into cash. Now that was a further and major insult to his father. And just to anticipate a little, he goes off to a far country and ends up with pigs. So he ends up among the Gentiles. He's a Jew, and he ends up among the Gentiles, and he loses his inheritance. Now, the Jewish law took a very dim view of that. And what happened, if you had done that, if you had been a Jew who had lost your inheritance to the Gentiles, if you came home, if you came back to your village, everybody would gather round. There was a rather frightening ceremony. They would get an earthenware pot, and in this earthenware pot, they would put some burnt corn and something else as well, I can't remember. You put some sort of burnt stuff, smash the pot, and then throw you out, chuck you out, cut you off from your people. So if he was liquidating assets and then going off to a Gentile country, he was going very, very far. And the whole village would have known, and the father would appear as a complete idiot. The whole family, everybody would be talking about them. What a crazy family. I think we have another picture. Yes, it's amazing what you can get on the internet. There you are. There's the father giving the money to the son. Okay. And then there's the one on the road. So he took his journey into a far country. He wanted independence. He wanted to get as far as possible away from his family. And he wanted complete independence from his father. So he got a ticket all the way to Kazakhstan or somewhere. And there he squandered his property in loose living. Now, there's a great debate about the phrase "the riotous living," and it is best translated, he lived recklessly or without saving. Actually, that's the word used. Without making any saving from his money. He spends it all. It's not actually, when he gets back, his brother says, oh, he's been with these girls, he's been with the prostitutes. The word doesn't necessarily imply that. It's about squandering his property. So he's been living without saving, lavishly, wastefully, prodigally, I suppose, and he has scattered his the word is all he had, his property. He squandered his property. The word is actually how do you pronounce it? Ousia, substance, which becomes a very important word in theology. His being. He squanders his being, actually. He squanders his substance, that's what it means. It squanders his property. But this word has actually to do with the verb to be. To be. So he is losing his substance as a human being. This is where he's on a downward spiral. It's all described quite quickly. And then when he had spent everything, okay, it's all gone, in a Gentile country, a great famine arose. So, not only has he mucked up his life, but now external circumstances are conspiring against him, which is something, I'm afraid, that tends to happen. And he began to be in want. He began to lack. So, he went and joined himself to one of the citizens of that country. So here was this man who wanted independence, freedom, I'm me, and he ends up being joined to a pagan landowner, a wealthy pagan man. He ends up as a hired servant, if that, a labourer of a pagan man. So his dream of independence has somewhat unravelled. And he sent him, his mission was to go into the fields and feed swine. Well, we know that Jews and pigs don't go together. And so this is a further descent. He has lost his family. He's lost his family identity. He's lost his racial identity. He's lost his religious identity. It's all gone. It's pretty dire. The fields to feed swine. I remember being in Ghana, and when you saw in a part that was partly Muslim and partly Christian, and when you saw pigs, you knew you were in a Christian place. It was quite... but Jews and Muslims don't like pigs. They're very intelligent animals, you know. You know the famous remark of Churchill. What is it? Cats look down on us, dogs look up at us, but pigs treat us as equals. Can we have some pigs? We've got lots of pigs. Poor man, yes, and some other ones as well. There he is. He's getting... Oh, there he is. He's really on the way down. Poor man. And... Yes, okay, he would gladly have fed on the pods. And no one gave him anything. That's poignant. No one gave him anything. Total isolation. Utterly abandoned. This is the lowest point. And then this astonishing phrase, but when he came to himself, he came to himself. That's much developed in the monastic tradition, the return to yourself. It's an Augustinian idea that we tend, as a result of sin, to be distracted by outward things and to lose ourselves. There are some very eloquent passages in the Confessions, to lose ourselves in outward things. We get carried away, we get swept here and there by outward things. And then we need to return to ourself as the first step towards returning to God, to come back. And he realized, that it's like the alcoholic who just has to say, I am an alcoholic. That's returning to yourself. And so this poor man just realizes, I am in a mess. And the hunger is the sign, is the symbol of it. This huge inner emptiness. This can't be right. This can't be right. It's an astonishing story, really. So he says, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, but I perish here with hunger. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. Now, you can read that in two ways. You can read it as a first stage of genuine repentance. I think it is. But it's also, he's being quite practical here, because he knows he's going to go back, and he might face this thing of the smashed pot, all that ceremony. And he's got his father, at the very least, is going to say, well, I want something back. And he's got nothing left. So he's got to get some credit in the bank. So you can say, well, if I go back and say I'm prepared to work for you, it's a bit like, Jacob working for Laban in the hope of his wife. And if I work for you, then I may be able to repay you. I have read slightly cynical interpretations of this. I wouldn't go for it. I think this is a genuine first step in repentance. But you could say this. And so he arose and came to his father. Okay, isn't this beautiful though? Sorry, I'm doing all the talking. I'm getting these insights from you. But while he was yet at a distance, his father saw him. Now, that can't have been coincidence. You know, the father must have been looking out. So the father was up on his balcony on the edge of this narrow little road that ran out of the village. And his father knew it was all going to end in disaster. He knew that. But he hasn't given up hope. And he just wait there. And this poor lad, so he saw him at a distance. Now, it has been pointed out by a learned exegete that this connects with Isaiah 57:19. Peace, peace to the far and to the near, says the Lord, and I will heal him. It's interesting because the other son is near. There's one son who's far and there's another son who's near. And neither of them have peace. And the Lord says, peace, peace to them, and I will heal him. So he comes back. I mean, I think this is an incredibly moving moment. His father saw him while he was yet at a distance, had compassion, which meant that the word means his innards are turned inside out. He's churned up inside when he sees his poor son in this pitiable state. Now, he ran. He ran. Now, an Oriental or Middle Eastern landowner living in the middle of a village would not run. Again, he was making a fool of himself because the whole village would see him suddenly going up. What would have been expected of him is that he would sit in his house waiting for the son to come in and prostrate himself. But he runs, so he gathers up his longcloth and goes charging off down the village street. So they're all coming out of the windows. And so they're all probably following him to see what's going to happen. Now, who could run, and this is interesting when we get to Rembrandt, but who could run, who could do that kind of thing, was the mother. It was all right for the mother to run out. Yeah, if her son had got that was the sort of thing that mothers were expected to do. So he's actually not just behaving like a father, he's behaving like a mother. This is interesting. And Rembrandt seems to have picked that up in a rather remarkable way, as we may see later in a minute. Okay, where are we now? Father, yeah, so his father is running. Now, the father, you see, imagine if it's true, I mean, it's certainly true there was this awful ceremony, and imagine this was in Jesus' mind, and this was in the mind of, when he was telling this story, they all knew, if you had a son who'd behaved like this, what should happen to this son when he came back to the village? And the father, again, does this unexpected, unpredictable thing, and deliberately goes outside the village. He runs out down the road, so that the villagers can't get hold of the son. And then, get the earthenware pot and put the burnt corn in and smash it and chuck him out. And of course, the villagers are going to come running after him and see. And what he does is embrace him. Okay, well, we've got lots of embraces. There's one, tearful. That's one. That's one. That's one. Okay, now leave that one there. That's the famous Rembrandt one. And he embraces him, and the embrace is a sign of forgiveness. David does it to Absalom. When Absalom, who's a bit of a wild lad and comes to an unhappy end and causes his father a great deal of trouble, when Absalom, after 2 years' absence, comes back, David embraces him. And David was a man capable of doing some very unexpected things, and kissed him. And notice that he says nothing. The father doesn't say anything. He just embraces him. And it actually falls on his neck and kisses him, and really kisses him. It's not just a peck on the cheek, or nice to see you again. It's a real strong kiss. And if you think of the villagers, they would have seen this. If they'd been having a private conversation, the villagers wouldn't have heard it. But the villagers would have seen this, and they would have known this meant the father, this crazy father, has forgiven his son. And then the son said to him, so the son has researched this speech in his mind, prepared his confession, we might say. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Now he stops there, because there was another bit, right, about being a hired servant. Now, he doesn't say that. Now, why doesn't he say it? This is an interesting question. Because I'd always assumed something, and then I read something, no, it might mean something else. Why? Any ideas why? You're awfully quiet tonight.
Yeah. Cut them off.
The father would have interrupted him. Yeah, I think that's what we automatically think, that the father interrupted him. But then, in theory, the father didn't know he was going to say that, so that perhaps the son realized that this was no longer relevant, that the father had so forgiven him. He wasn't expecting this. I mean, he would have been expecting, at the very least, an almighty row. And he suddenly realizes his father is on a different wavelength, and therefore all his prepared idea of making money and being a hired servant is irrelevant. So that it's at that point that he fully repents, in the sense of comes to a new understanding of his father. Anyway, I'll leave that with you. I mean, take it or leave it. Now, just an interesting thing about, do you notice that the two, do you notice anything about the two hands? One is, yes, exactly. One is very large and heavy and masculine and is on the shoulder, and the other is much more delicate. So this father is showing a paternal aspect and a maternal aspect at the same time. Just as he did when he ran down the street out of the village. So again, the father tends to break all these boundaries. But the father said to his servants. Now here we get new people suddenly. It's always interesting. Servants, bring quickly the best robe. The actual word is the first robe. Bring the first robe. And put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. Now you can imagine, especially the fathers of the church and other commentators inclined to mystical interpretation have spent a lot of time on what is the robe and what is the ring and what is the shoe. What are the shoes, the sandals? But clearly he is being reinstated as the son. Pharaoh, in the book of Genesis, does this to Joseph, who's another younger son. And Pharaoh takes off his signet ring and gives it to Joseph, and puts a special garment on him. It's remarkably parallel, and that's a sign that Joseph is, as it were, becomes the vice regent of the kingdom of Egypt, and is sharing in the dignity of a pharaoh. And so the father is treating his son as someone almost royal. The shoes on his feet, the servants would not have worn shoes, or it should be sandals, but it would not. A servant would not have worn. The servant would have gone barefoot. So the fact that he's wearing sandals is a sign that he has resumed his position in the household. I remember once in a homily, somebody said it was also a sign that he could go off again. It's interesting that the father let him free. That's interesting. Bring the fatted calf. There always seems to be one of those hanging around in the Bible. Bring the fatted calf. Now, the fatted calf is more than a sheep or a goat. It's succulent and special, and kill it, and let us eat and make merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to make merry. Now, who are they? You see, probably the father is inviting the whole village to this. This is another thought. This isn't just, as I say, this isn't happening on a nice mansion on top of a hill, surrounded by Rottweilers and so on. It's happening in a village, and you couldn't. The whole village had seen this happening. You couldn't just leave them all standing out. I mean, they'd have been looking through the windows anyway. And so you bring them in. And so so there's a reconciliation with the village taking place. It's extraordinary. And then these great lines, for this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Now we've had a lost sheep and we've had a lost coin, and now we've got a lost son. For this my son was dead and is alive again. I mean, this is theologically rich, is it not? Theologically suggestive. He was lost and is found. And they began to make merry. Okay. We haven't got making merry, have we? But got lots of embracing. Now, what's that? Sorry? Making merry? That is making merry. Yeah, that just shows. I wouldn't recognise it wouldn't know it if I saw it. Okay, that's making merry. Okay, well, we'll let them make merry, and then right. Oh yeah, now. Okay. Then this business. His elder son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. So they've invited the local fiddlers to come in, and all of this. So there's a big party. There's a big party going on, and there's dancing. And he called one of the servants. The word actually can mean a boy. A boy. He called a boy and asked what this meant. Now, surely already that's a bit south, because he must jolly well have known. Probably. I mean, okay, it says he was in the field, but news travels, remarkably quickly. In these cases, and it's a little bit unlikely there. He called and asked what this meant, and so the boy says, your brother has come, your brother, calls him your brother, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has received him safe and sound. If I remember rightly, I think that's just one word in Greek, which means in good health. It means, some people have translated it, in peace. He has received him in peace. Okay, but he was angry and refused to go in. So that's him angry there. Now, okay, so the boy must run off, run into the room and whisper in the ear of the father. Now the father, again, goes out. He goes out. And again, he would have been making a fool of himself. Or everybody would really, something going on. If you're having a great big banquet and so on, and then, I don't know, the mobile phone goes, and then they turn white and then they run out of the room. Well, you know there's something amiss. And it's rather odd when the father is throwing this great party that suddenly he gets up and goes out. And people would immediately again start, what's he doing? He's a very strange man, this father. And he goes out. So this is his second going out. He's gone out of the village to meet the younger son, and now he goes out again. He can't rest until everyone is at the banquet of the kingdom of heaven, in that sense. Everyone is there. He goes out and entreated him. It's very, I think we've got that, haven't we? That's his father trying to entreat him, I think, and not getting anywhere, obviously. But he was angry and refused to go in. Well, sorry, yes. And he answered, this is awful, the accumulated bitterness of the religious person. It's a real occupational hazard. The accumulated bitterness. It's frightening. Look, these many years I've served you, I never disobeyed your command, I've been a good boy, done this, yet you never gave me a kid that I may make merry with my friends. Well, if he'd asked for one. But when this son of yours, doesn't say my brother, he says this son of yours, had, I remember that a guest master at the monastery, if there was a difficult guest, the brethren would say to him, "Oh, this guest of yours," he was no longer the guest of the monastery. If it was somebody fine, then it was our guest. But when it was a problem guest, this guest of yours, and this is exactly what the elder brother is doing. It's devoured your living with harlots. Well, he's put that in. Maybe he's just got that kind of mind. You killed for him the fatted calf. And again, one could, we're just sort of going along these things fairly lightly, but just as there is something, very profound, very sort of John Paul II-ish about the man ending up hungry in a far country among the pigs and so on. John Paul II goes on about this at length and returning to himself. So there is a dark depth in the anger of this other brother. And so the father says son. He uses a word which is actually more child, child. And then this beautiful expression which is almost Johannine, it's almost like the Gospel of John. You are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. Yes, this chap's already got his inheritance. Actually, I've given you everything. But this resentment, I suppose resentment's the word, is it? What is the word for this elder son? You know, if there's the prodigal son, which is one word for him, what's the word for the elder son? What's the... Sorry? Jealousy. Jealousy, yes. I suppose yes. Yeah? I suppose he is jealous. Bitter. Yeah, bitter. He's bitter, resentful, angry. It's a very... You know, you've got two completely different kinds of vice here, haven't you? You've got the squandering and the riotous, reckless living. And you've got this other stuff, which is actually far harder to overcome. I think when we went through the 7 vices, I think we touched on that. You know, the Desert Fathers say it's much easier to overcome, you know, lust and gluttony and avarice and those that the possessive, the rushing off in search of pleasure, compared to anger and envy. And these things go far deeper.
Can we call him the proud son?
The proud son, yes. I suppose he is proud.
Perhaps that's what it's all about. Perhaps it's kind of pride in that he is doing very well.
Yeah.
Self-righteous.
Self-righteous, indeed, yeah. Self-righteous. Yeah. Disappointed. Yeah, he is. He's secretly disappointed. And all of that. Now, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to make merry and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. The father is inviting him into joy. Now, what is striking about this? That's not a slightly unfair question. I don't mean what the father says, but surely the striking thing, that's the end. We don't know what happened. We don't know what happened. And Jesus is telling this parable to the scribes and the Pharisees.
But he's saying this knowing what is going to happen to himself. It's sort of is almost prophet-like. He's prophesizing what is going to happen to himself. That he, you know,
the father
think he's dead, and then he rises.
Oh, I see.
And then
yes,
disciples think he is lost, and then they find him again in the room.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's rather brilliant. I hadn't thought of that. Well, that doesn't make it brilliant, but. That is interesting. So, well, yes, that leads on to a whole. Yeah, we'll come back to that one. That's good. But surely the striking thing, we're left, and that Rembrandt's picture, you know, just the elder son is just there, and you just don't know which way he's going to jump. Yes.
And just if you follow the parallel you drew between the first son being the tax collector and the sinners, and the second son being the Pharisees and the scribes, we don't know what happened to the second son, because Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and the scribes, leaving them.
Yeah, exactly.
To come in
yes,
or to stay out.
Indeed. Yeah, he's leaving them the choice. So it ends up, you know, you're part of the story. Where do you fit into this story? It's a little like the twist that there is at the end of the Good Samaritan about who showed himself a neighbour, not who is the neighbour, but who showed himself a neighbour. Go and do likewise. And so here, it's very So it's a bit alarming, this parable, really, because you are, and then now this connects up with what Simon was saying. But when I was on retreat in monastery recently, and they were reading a book at meal, and it was the book by Henry Nouwen on the parable of the prodigal son, and he did a good thing. With whom do we identify? We can identify, in fact, or we're called to identify with all three people. And we're called to identify, I mean, we can identify ourselves, you know, the desire for independence that takes us away and ends in debris and disaster and so on, and pigs and so forth. That, and then the coming back. But we can identify with the one who, the elder brother, and yet we are invited to identify with the Father. To be like the Father, and to go in search of the Son. In other words, and therefore to be like Jesus. And because Jesus has the attitude of the Father, that is why he will be crucified in the end. So this eating with sinners will take him to the cross, because people can't handle this, and the anger of the elder son will hold out. But you're surely right, Simon. I mean, this is the language of the resurrection. So in perhaps in several different ways, the parable points to the Paschal mystery, points to the death and resurrection of Jesus. But it is quite stunning. But the Father, you know, this word kenosis, you know, the abasement of the Son, this word that he emptied himself. He emptied himself and became a human being, and was humbler yet, even to death on a cross. The kenosis of God in Jesus, and that this Father is continually emptying himself. He gives away all his property, and then he gives himself in forgiveness to the Son, and he goes out after the other son. He's continually making a fool of himself in his desire to bring people into this great banquet, and the fatted calf and the music and the dancing and all of that.